Welcome to the sequence on supplier relationship management, short SRM. Why is SRM important? Well, a simple purchasing department which only orders goods which are bought on a spot buy basis does not usually have a very elaborated and systematic supplier relationship management. Actually, there is not too much of a relationship developing to suppliers very often. However, and that's why SRM stands very much in the core of the development of our field in the last 20 years. That's where SRM has grown on importance in the process of professionalization of purchasing. That is why we should now have a closer look at SRM. Essentially, we're going to discuss right now the main elements of supplier relationship, in particular focusing on supplier evaluation, supplier development, and possibly phase out of a supplier. That is how a supplier relationship management system typically looks like. Starting with the selection of suppliers, a systematic selection of suppliers. This is something which we are not going to discuss further here in this sequence because it has elsewhere been discussed. However, the next step then is of importance for us now. Supplier evaluation. Once a supplier has been selected and is active, the results of these activities have to be evaluated. That is supplier evaluation. Possibly this leads to either a phase out of the supplier, so if the supplier is really not good, it leads to a normal continuation of the business relationship in the future, or in between supplier development, that is a process of improving the supplier. Now let's look in detail at each of these three steps: supplier evaluation, supplier development, and eventually phase out. What is supplier evaluation? Definition of supplier evaluation sounds like the quantification process designed to stimulate the decision process inside the evaluating buying company. That is, it has an internal perspective. That is important to remember. It has two perspectives. One of them is internal. It supports the company to make their decisions about this supplier continuation or not. Or, and that's the second part of the definition, through the incentives it invokes to stimulate a change in behavior in the evaluated supplying company. So that is the external perspective here. To change the supplier, to improve the supplier. So supplier evaluation has an internal perspective. It supports, it's a decision support element, and it has an external perspective to improve a supplier related to supplier. Basically, we can distinguish between two types of supplier evaluation: an operative one and a more strategic one. The operative supplier evaluation is looking at the day-to-day business of the performance of the supplier. Typically, data are retrieved from the ERP system, the enterprise resource planning system. It is about logistic data, how performant the supplier is, are there any delays and the like. This type of supplier evaluation helps to steer the supplier on a short notice and is an ongoing process. The strategic supplier evaluation typically takes place at a one-year basis, once a year, with serial production, or if it is a project-based environment, then maybe after a project. It has a different input. Typically, it is kind of a survey where those stakeholders in the company which have been in contact with the supplier evaluate the supplier. And who is typically interacting? That would, of course, be the purchasing department, but also production logistics, maybe quality, or, for example, R&D if they have co-developed something. And that is the strategic evaluation part. That is exactly what is the input then for the further development of the supplier, or also for the decision to change it. Here we have an example of how such a supply evaluation system looks like. This is a model which has been implemented with many larger companies. And if you look at the top of the pyramid, it first depicts the departments which are involved. And here we have the typical industrial environment. Now, obviously, depending on what is the commodity at hand, the partners may change. If it is about advertising services, then probably the marketing department will play a role and not necessarily the quality department, right? So this has to be adjusted for each commodity. But in the normal case, we have all of these four partners. And then each of them will evaluate the quality of the supplier from their core perspective. That means purchasing from the purchasing behavior, or quality would then look at how good is the quality, and so on and so on. Another element which each of the departments should evaluate is the relationship, the soft facts. How is the interaction going on? On top of that, a systematic evaluation also includes the supplier's systems. That is, how good are the processes, how good are the systems, meaning how much potential does the supplier have for the future. And finally, last not least, but this is also very important, and should not only apply to the purchasing department, but to all departments, what about the costs the supplier is incurring? Is the supplier cost efficient, or are we not satisfied with this? And if you go down in this pyramid, there will eventually be more detailed questions to evaluate each of these areas. And here we have an example. I will not go into detail now, but you can just get a feeling. There's a question concerning one of these fields. And what is proposed here are 4 anchor keys, anchor sentences, how to respond to this. So you see there are 4 possible answers. And this is made to have a certain objectivation to get similar results if different people answer this question. Finally, I would like to highlight one little spot, what you see on the top. It's about improvement of the supplier. This gives us the link to the next topic, which is supplier development. Supplier evaluation and supplier development, they are twins. They are very much linked to each other. Without a supplier evaluation, it is virtually not possible to make a meaningful supplier development because we do not know what is wrong, right? The other way around, without a supplier development, the problems which have been detected in the evaluation may not go away. Supplier development. Supplier development has been defined as any effort of a buying firm with a supplier to increase its performance and or capability, so this is the long-term perspective, to meet the buying firm's short-term and or long-term supply needs. So important to remember here, it refers to a supplier whose work should be improved, whose performance, with a target of satisfying the requirements which the buying company established and expects from the supplier. Actually, here we have 2 types of supply development which can be distinguished. One form would be the passive or indirect supply development. This is what we have seen on the page before, when the evaluation results show an improvement area and where then the supplier is asked to improve this area, but, and that is why it is so-called passive, because the supplier alone should do the improvement, not the buyer. The buyer would not help the supplier with that. After a year, a re-evaluation takes place. Did the supplier solve the problem? So in that case, the supplier is free on its own to make the choices it deems necessary, but will not get further assistance by the buyer except for the hint to do this change. The other type is the so-called active or direct supplier development. As the name already indicates, this is a direct interaction between buyer and supplier who jointly work and improve the operations of the supplier. Now, in that case, the buyer may want to send some people, at least on a temporary basis, to work with the supplier on operations, on quality improvements, on logistics, which are the typical targets. Of course, active supplier development has a big potential. It changes more because we assume that the buyer, the customer is the larger company, hence has more experience in that and can help the supplier. But on the other hand, and that is why it's a little bit risky, it is also a very intensive, very expensive way, and there can be some problems occurring. Think about the case of a European large automotive OEM, which established a factory in a remote country in overseas where they have not been present before. However, their competitors have been active since decades. Now, this OEM established a car factory, produced the car, but was very disappointed with the quality of the suppliers. So this is a typical case where they then opted for doing a supplier development scheme. They started a large project on supplier development, but at a certain moment of time, they had to make a crisis setting, because what they discovered was the following. They would work with the suppliers, they would help them to improve, but in the end, most profit from this exercise would go to the other customers of these suppliers. Why? The supplier profits from their improvement, but obviously also transfers this to its remaining production. So our OEM in case was just buying a small fraction of their turnover, of the supplier's turnover, maybe 10%, 15%, but improving the other 85%, which was sold to its competitors. So essentially, they were making their competitors stronger. They made a crisis setting. Should they stop it? In that particular case, they had to continue because this was a global plant for the entire world, the single plant for this model. So they had to invest that, but it's definitely not the best solution. And that is why what we are seeing here is a strong need to make a decision when are we going to invest into active supplier development and when we keep only the passive form. And here we see a model which has been developed, among others, to help to make this decision. We see here on the preferred customer matrix on the x-axis the results of the supplier evaluation between a bad and a good evaluation. And on the y-axis we see whether, and that's obviously what we have assessed before, whether our company is a standard customer of this supplier or whether it's really a preferred customer. And the argument now goes that supplier development should preferably be applied in the case the supplier is not fully performant, but we, as the OEM, as the customer, we are a preferred customer. That is, we are going to profit from the investment which we are making in the supplier. In this picture, we see this in the quadrant C, which we see on the left side of the picture. Right? The good situation or the good relationship is there, but not, unfortunately, an adequate performance of the supplier. The target is obviously to have all suppliers, that's the small dots which you see here on this picture, to be placed in this dark green area. That means they are good, ideally the best of the world, and they like us and they treat us as customers better than they do with others. It is a little bit debatable, also among the experts on the field, whether this field B, what we see here in the middle of this matrix, if supply development could not actually be used as a means to improve the relationship with the supplier. So in that case, we would also apply supplier development activities for suppliers which are medium good and need some development. And well, we, however, are not yet a preferred customer, but use this as a chance to become a preferred customer. So possibly this would be another function of supplier development to improve the relationship with the supplier. Now, what if this fails, or beforehand the supplier was performing so poorly that we decide not to continue working with this supplier? If it's a project business, it is rather simple. We do not order again and don't invite the supplier for tender. But if we're on a serial business, in particular, then we do have a challenge, or if it's a supplier which is an ongoing, giving an ongoing service to our company or so on. In that case, we need a professional phase out. So this is the last part of supplier relationship, the phase out phase. Very often this has been overlooked, but we do need to look at this carefully. For example, about the timing. When are we going to communicate this? And consider here a recent example of a case which also went through the press, where phase out was completely did not work out at all. In that case, a company discontinued the business with a supplier, or more precisely, did not award this supplier with a business for the next model. So the supplier was supposed only to deliver the parts into the ongoing series, but when this was put to stop a couple of months in the future, then would not have any follow-up jobs to do. Supplier reacted in a way to ask for additional money for an indemnization. The buying company would not want to pay that. And what was the supplier doing? Supplier then kind of retaliated and stopped the production of the buying company. So it interrupted the production. Even more subtle what they did, they bought another little supplier who was about to go bankrupt with the sole purpose to get him out of business and to stop the production of its former customer. Now that is something which we obviously do not want. In the end, the customer had to pay a little bit, and after some time discontinued the relationship completely. But an important issue is to avoid that type of dispute. It is not clear how any of the parties would have profited from this type of dispute. Nonetheless, that is what is happening, and that is what we need to be prepared as good purchasers. And that's why we have to look carefully at the timing. When are we going to phase out a supplier? We also have to take into consideration interdependencies. Maybe for our plant, the supplier is not good, but he may be active in other plants of our group of companies. So hence, this is something which has to be taken into consideration, also pooling considerations. Maybe we lose a volume discount, which may possibly change the evaluation of the supply. So we have to look at the interdependencies. And last, not least, and particularly in industrial markets, there are not so many suppliers. There is quite some possibility that in some years' time, we may again need exactly the same supplier with whom we discontinued the business right now. And for that purpose, it makes sense to carefully plan the phase out in a way that no relationship is destroyed and that future revival of the relationship can take place. So, concluding, we have quickly moved through a professional supplier relationship management model, starting with the selection of the supplier, then the supplier development or the supplier evaluation, right, which should be a cross-functional approach, then went to supplier phase out or alternatively supplier development. And these are the lessons learned which we derive from that. In particular, to highlight, a cross-functional supplier evaluation is necessary. This is the input for supplier development activities, which could be active or passive, or alternatively a phase out of the supplier. And this is typically or very often neglected, but it makes sense to have a systematic phase out process also with fallback plans again. And of course, the best situation is that our evaluation shows that the supplier is so good that we're going to continue the business. Thank you for your attention.